So here I'm starting by referring to the advisor summary sheet and talking to a student who's got low level but balanced aptitudes. Previously we've looked at profiles which are average or higher levels, but for profiles in the bottom third of the population or thereabouts, we present the information differently. For most profiles there's a percentile score at the bottom. When scores are low, as defined by a formula, then what Moresby does is stop directly comparing individuals with others of their age, because the scores look extremely low, and instead they move the focus onto the internal relativities rather than the level of the profile. People who go through the certification training may well spend some time understanding that formula. But in essence, what Moresby are doing is they're attempting to keep the focus on the shape or the pattern of the scores rather than the level. And to do this, they inflate the bars so they look a little bit more acceptable. And the process is called ipsitization. In the Moresby Manager interface, you'll see this identified in the Student Assessment tab on the right hand side. So what they've done here is added 2 to each of the assessment scores. That's ipsitized plus 2. So verbal would have started off at 6, and just as a bit of background, that's somewhere between the 11th and 23rd percentile against the general population. Now interestingly, this student is not English as a first language, and they have completed the vocabulary test. Now what that's done is it's added 3 score points to verbal and also 1 to the mechanical reasoning assessment. And that's because, particularly if English is not your first language, there's some quite hard words in the mechanical assessment. So this person actually started off with a scale score of 3 on verbal, bringing them way down here. And we can see in terms of their approach that they didn't answer all the questions. They got most of the way through, but at quite a low accuracy rate. Given that items start off easy and get harder as you go, it means they also got quite a lot of the easy items wrong. And what we don't know is whether they just knocked through the questions and didn't get to the last couple, which is pretty unusual as an approach. Typically, if people are just knocking through, they go straight to the end, which in the numerical, abstract and mechanical would potentially be the case, and probably also the spatial. They might have just left one at the end. We really don't know someone's approach to the assessment until you ask them. If this individual had got something like 80 or maybe 90% complete, then we'd be pretty sure they've worked methodically through and just ran out of time. But when they finished, we're less sure of how they approached it. Now, students don't know that their results have been ipsitized, and it's highly unlikely they'll find out unless you choose to tell them, and you normally wouldn't. So I'm now going to impersonate the student. What I will point out is, although this is to some extent a balanced profile, there is obviously a standout for mechanical, we can still get some value from the profiling. Firstly, having balanced aptitudes suggests that somebody is satisfied with jobs which are more varied in nature. Secondly, if we average the spatial and mechanical scores to get a level of practicality that's above their capability for theoretical learning, so it would be a practical, hands-on approach, and the chances are the student learns better by practice, trial and error, project work, etc., rather than theoretical book-based learning. And the other point, if you remember back to your 1, 2, 3, 4 interpretation from the tests and theory section, if you've done this, is that when mechanical is stronger than spatial, as it is in this occasion, it suggests a serialist, step-by-step approach to tasks and planning. And that's great because people can then absorb knowledge over time at their own pace. And while this student might not thrive in a fast-moving curriculum, which is based around a lot of book work, if they do learn to do something in a step-by-step way and internalise that, they'll be able to perform those tasks as well as anybody. And we need to remember that. So, moving on to interests. The first thing I notice is a low level of interest in working with information. We find that generally when students aren't academically interested and they don't want to stay in school, or at least don't want to carry on in formal education afterwards. They have a fairly strong interest in science, whatever that means for this individual. It could be related to their very strong interest in sport. And to get a specialist interest presented, they have had to say "I could and would like to" questions in the interest questionnaire. So they've said they're good at sport to get that. And also they've expressed interest in advising people. If we want to look a bit more detail, we can look at the wheel of work. We can see there's a broad-based interest in working with things in all areas, but also advise and help and persuade under people. Training would just be the strongest under advise and help. And I'm betting that sport would be an area they're wanting to get into from looking at this information. Now I'll close this down and we'll look at personality. Here we see a fairly strongly defined profile. They have a clearly defined preference for focusing on the outer world of people and things around them, fairly strong extroversion, rather than their inner world, and they have a preference for not dealing just with the facts when they're making decisions, but thinking how decisions might impact individuals. So that would be the feeling side. So some students might say, okay, well, this is right, it's clearly a fact, I'm just going to tell you what the situation is. This individual is more likely to think, well, if I do that, how's it going to impact your self-esteem, your feelings, etc., and take that into account in their behaviour. And interestingly, they prefer a spontaneous and flexible lifestyle rather than structure and order. You know, we kind of predicted from the aptitudes that it would be the other way because they were a serialist. But this kind of mismatch of information is not that unusual. And of course, people are complex. So on the one hand, the information from the aptitudes suggests they operate in a step-by-step way, while the personalities suggest they thrive on spontaneity and are more reactive than planful and not drawn to structure. Reality is one of these components is stronger within the individual. Now I'm betting it would be the personality, but you would never know until you speak to the individual. Now moving on to the careers under my choices, Moresby generates a start point of academic attainment based on a formula around the assessment scores. Here it's suggesting VCAL Senior or Vet Cert 3. Now if you don't offer VCAL at school, you could either leave it as it is and work on the vet options, or you could choose to change the setting. So if we look at the careers here, there's a range of careers. If we change the setting, say to VCE subjects, that would change, and some different careers would come in which would require a little bit more academic attainment, or at least academic orientation. And what we can't do is set the system so no one in the school will get anything other than 8R over 90, for example. It's always got to be based partly on the assessment scores. One of the things I'd always do when I look at a student's career interests is try and categorise them into broader areas. Now this is always going to be harder with balanced profiles, because with a balanced profile no specific direction is indicated. The system then is going to push out a few looking at their other strong areas of interest. So we get a broad range of areas suggested here. We can certainly say there's not a lot of academic attainment required for the majority of these, although electrician would be one of the harder ones here. Now a student might love what they're seeing, but it's quite likely that you'd want to look at them in different ways. You might, for example, want to focus more on their aptitudes than anything else, and that would change some careers which come in: tourism, leisure, sales of different kinds, some practical hands-on work. If we untick aptitudes and tick on interests, this is probably going to be more what the student is looking at, although that strong interest in science will bring in careers which might require a lot more academic rigour than they're expecting to put in. And my bet for a student such as this is that focusing on personality, particularly when it's strongly defined, is likely to bring up the kind of areas they'd be more interested in. And we could, for example, say, let's focus on apprenticeships, traineeships as well. So what we're doing here is we're bringing in a wide range of careers which are personality and communication based, really, outdoors. And it's difficult to know without speaking to the student, but I'd imagine that the careers in the top half, in fact pretty much all of these careers, would be the kind of things which the student would consider might be reasonable start points for their career. Now I want to go and look at subjects and focus on options at 16. Now the system is picking up all the kind of things you'd expect based on the careers. I will point out that in Victoria we have VCAL, Victorian Certificate of Applied Learning, and Sport and Rec would come out high for them. These are actually industry pathways, and we have 4 embedded in the system. Clearly they wouldn't be in your system if you're not in Victoria. And it would be very normal for schools to turn off specific subjects if they don't offer them internally. So a lot of schools would turn off the vet subjects because they don't want students to be picking 8 or 10 vet subjects they want to do, particularly if none of them are done in-house, but they'd also want them to focus on the options which are available in-house. So with any of these, a student can click on them and find out what's involved. There's quite a lot of complexity within the options at 16, but in terms of identifying appropriate level of problem solving for particular subjects, it's actually really difficult to do that. So you may get situations where some of the subjects would appear too difficult for the student, bearing in mind what you know of them. But if you take them, that same student, and put them in a highly academic environment, it might be a bit like taking an average sports person and putting them in an elite sports team. They might rise to the occasion because of support from those around them. So there's a wide range of academic attainment sitting behind any of these subject options. For a student like this who's less academically oriented, you might click on vocational routes and look at the kind of areas which would lead into work, typically through an apprenticeship or traineeship. So if we click on health and fitness, we've got information here on apprenticeships and some media for them. Thank you.